Well, hello again, and welcome back to the Rowan Files. I hope there are some people out there listening. I am doing these stories quite quickly, I think, mainly because I look after my grandchildren, full-time carer for them, so the stories come and then I have to get them on these places before I get fed up with them. So today's story begins with an old village bridge swallowed by fog and a file deliberately left empty for nearly 40 years. In Alder Vale, the Lavender Ladies, as I started out with Lavender Ladies stories, were once dismissed as harmless old women, collecting strange little tales over tea and lavender cake. But after Edith Prowse dies, Nell Rowan discovers something hidden inside Edith's cottage wall, a cabinet filled with carefully preserved accounts of things the village chose not to explain. At the very back sits one unfinished file, a bridge, a disappearance, a girl the village forgot, and a sentence written in Edith's unmistakable hand. The bridge will be crossed again. So this tale is about memory, truths, the truths that villages bury, and the strange places where silence lingers long after the people are gone. So settle in and let's have a mystery and solve it of the file Edith Prowse left waiting. And this is typical actually of villages in the UK. They do have lots of secrets. So this one is definitely from the Rowan Files. And excuse me then, I picked up the microphone. It doesn't begin with a scream, nor with a shadow in a doorway, but with something almost impossibly intriguing. A forgotten folder. By now, most people in Alder Vale had accepted that the Lavender Ladies were gone, or as gone as women like that ever truly become. Miss Edith Prowse, Maud Fletcher, Beryl Vane, and Iris Dunn. The four of them had once occupied the back corner table of the tea rooms every Thursday afternoon. For nearly 30 years, they had watched the village change, watched children become parents, and parents become photographs. They watched shops close, old paths vanish beneath neat modern paving stones. And all the while they had listened, not for gossip, for disturbances, the things people dismissed far too quickly. A sentence repeated by two strangers. A clock stopping at the wrong moment. A name heard before it was spoken. A place that made air feel somehow crowded. Most villagers had laughed affectionately at them. The Lavender Ladies, they'd say with a fond roll of the eyes. Old women and their superstitions. But Nell Rowan knew better, because strange things did happen. Not monstrous things, not creatures in forests, not chains dragging through attics, just moments, tiny fractures in ordinary life. And long ago, Edith Prowse had once said something Nell never forgot. Most people think the world is held together by facts. It isn't. It's held together by what people agree to ignore. At the time, Nell had laughed. Now, standing alone in Edith's cottage, months after the funeral, the words returned to her with an uncomfortable clarity. The cottage smelled faintly of lavender water and old paper. Edith's niece from Sussex had finally written asking whether Nell might sort through the remaining things before the property was sold. Anything of value, the letter had said, keep, and I will pick it up. Nell suspected the woman meant silverware, but Edith Prowse had valued stranger things than silver. Receipts from 1974, postcards with no writing, train tickets kept inside books, a cracked thimble wrapped in tissue paper labelled "for remembering." Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows while the village settled into evening. The kettle hissed gently on the stove. Somewhere beyond the lane a dog barked once. Nell moved slowly through the cottage, studying, brushing dust from shelves and opening drawers stiff with age. And then she found the cabinet. It sat behind a stack of old parish newsletters, narrow and dark, built awkwardly into the wall, as though added years later by someone who did not entirely trust visibility. Locked, naturally. Edith had trusted almost nobody with important things. The key, surprisingly, was still inside a blue teacup nearby. Nell stared at it for a moment and then opened the cabinet. Inside sat 12 folders tied carefully with faded lavender ribbon, each one handwritten, each one dated, and on the first folder, in Edith Prowse's sharp, unmistakable script, are the words, Rowan Files. Preserved accounts of the unexplained, misremembered, and quietly true. Nell felt a coldness move slowly through her chest. Not fear exactly, recognition. Beneath the title, another line had been added, smaller, more deliberate. Not to prove, to preserve. The kettle began screaming in the kitchen. Nell nearly dropped the folder. That night she sat beside the fire reading until after midnight. Some files were only a page long. Others contained sketches, witness accounts, maps, letters, newspaper cuttings, and annotations written by all 4 lavender ladies over decades. And what unsettled Nell most was not the strangeness, it was the consistency, the care, the seriousness. None of it read like fantasy, it read like record keeping. One file documented a woman who claimed she heard her dead husband cough every November beside the coal shed, and always on the first frost. Another described an old shortcut path children stopped using after multiple villagers independently described hearing footsteps behind them there, despite nobody ever appearing. One particularly thick folder concerned a bell that rang at impossible hours. Nell recognised that one immediately. Edith had underlined a sentence 3 times in violet ink. When places are burdened long enough, they begin repeating themselves. Hours passed unnoticed, rain softened, the fire collapsed inward, and eventually Nell reached the final folder. Unlike the others, it contained almost nothing. No witness accounts, no notes, no clippings. Just a sheet of paper, one single sheet actually. At the top was tomorrow's date. Nothing else, except one sentence, written in Edith's hand. The bridge will be crossed again. Nell stared at it for a very long time, because the old bridge road beyond Alder Vale had been closed for nearly 40 years. After the drowning, after the fog, after what had happened to Thomas Bellamy. Most of the village no longer spoke about it. Many younger residents didn't even know the bridge had existed. And yet, suddenly, sitting there in Edith Prowse's silent cottage, Nell could remember every whispered fragment she had ever heard about it. A man walking home through fog, footsteps where no one stood, the sound of water beneath stone, and a figure waiting halfway across. Not threatening, simply waiting. Nell closed the folder carefully. Outside, wind moved slowly through the trees. And somewhere in the distance, faint beneath the weather, she could have sworn she heard the sound of slow footsteps crossing wood. The following morning arrived, silver grey and damp. Mist rested low across Alder Vale, blurring rooftops and softening the distant hills into pale watercolour shapes. Nell barely slept. By 7 o'clock she had abandoned the cottage entirely and crossed the square, carrying 2 folders beneath her arm, intending to study them properly at the tea rooms, where human voices might thin the strange heaviness pressing against her thoughts. The village was only just waking. Mr. Harcourt lifted the shutters at the bakery. A milk van rattled past the war memorial. Somewhere behind the church, a rook called harshly from the trees. Everything ordinary. And yet Nell could not shake the uncomfortable sensation that something had already begun moving before dawn. At the tea rooms, Clara Bennett looked up immediately. "You look dreadful," she announced kindly. "Oh, thank you, Clara." "You've got Edith face." Nell paused halfway through removing her gloves. Edith face? That look she used to get when she thought she'd noticed something nobody else had. Clara placed tea beside her before Nell even ordered. Another inherited village ritual. "You've been up there sorting her things." Nell nodded. "And?" For a moment she considered dismissing it, saying little. Edith probably would have. But the weight of the folders beneath her arm made silence suddenly feel dishonest. "I found records," Nell said carefully. Clara blinked. "What sort of records?" Nell hesitated and then quietly. "Things the Lavender ladies investigated." To her surprise, Clara did not laugh. Instead, she glanced instinctively toward the window, lowered her voice and said, "Oh." That single word unsettled Nell more than ridicule would have. "You knew?" "Not knew exactly," Clara busied herself wiping an already clean table. "People just knew they kept things." "What things?" Clara shrugged uneasily. "Odd happenings, stories, complaints, things folk didn't want written down officially." "Why not?" because once something's written properly, it stops being gossip. An hour later, the tea rooms had filled with the gentle sounds of ordinary morning life, cutlery, teacups, rain against glass. Two farmers debating council drainage. And yet beneath it all, Nell remained distracted by the folders. Particularly one thin notation Maud Fletcher had added to the Bellamy file years earlier. Fog changes distances there. Such an odd sentence. Not poetic. Observational. The sort of thing Maud would write after checking it 3 separate times with a measuring tape. Nell opened the folder again carefully. Inside she found a rough, hand-drawn map of the old Bridge Road. There beside the river bend, Beryl Vane had written in sharp blue ink. Several witnesses independently reported hearing footsteps before visual contact. And underneath, in Iris Dunn's smaller handwriting, not echoes, rhythm too deliberate. Nell exhaled slowly. Good Lord. The Lavender ladies had treated this like an actual investigation. Not entertainment. Not storytelling. Inquiry. That thought lingered with her all morning, until shortly after 11, when the tea room door opened and the village fell unexpectedly quiet. Not fully silent, just enough. Enough for instinct to notice. A man stood just inside the doorway, damp from fog, removing driving gloves. Late 40s, perhaps. Ordinary face, ordinary coat. The sort of person nobody would remember afterward, and yet something about him immediately unsettled the room. He approached the counter politely. "Morning," he said. "Bit turned around out there." Clara smiled automatically. "Happens often enough. Road signs disappear in this fog." A few customers chuckled softly. The man nodded toward the hills beyond the village. "I ended up taking the old Bridge Road by mistake." The teaspoon slipped from Clara's hand. Not loudly, just enough. A tiny metallic sound against saucer porcelain. Nobody moved. The man noticed the silence at last. "What?" Clara stared at him. "Which Bridge Road?" "The old one through the woods." He frowned mildly. "Stone bridge over the river. Narrow thing. Nearly missed it in the fog." Nell felt something cold move slowly through her stomach. Because the old bridge had supposedly vanished almost 40 years ago. And the man was still speaking, unaware. "There's initials carved beneath the left rail," he said casually. "TB, I think." Nearly stopped to look properly. Old Mr. Pritchard finally spoke from the corner. "Thomas Bellamy." The stranger turned. "Who?" "The man who walked onto that bridge one November evening," Mr. Pritchard said quietly, "and never came back." The man gave his name as Daniel Mercer, but by early afternoon, Nell and Daniel were walking together toward the old Bridge Road. Fog had thickened rather than lifted. Alder Vale seemed suspended inside it. The entrance to the road was half swallowed by moss and wet branches. A rusted warning sign leaned sideways near the verge. Road closed ahead. Daniel stopped. This is it. Nell looked down the road slowly. It did not look abandoned, only avoided. There was a difference. They walked beneath overarching branches, heavy with dampness. No birdsong, no traffic. Only dripping water and the muffled softness of their own footsteps. Then the bridge appeared. Not dramatically, not like some grand, great supernatural vision. Worse than that, it looked ordinary. Stone supports, narrow timber crossing, iron lantern hooks, moss climbing the rails, as though it had simply continued existing somewhere the village had agreed not to look anymore. Daniel whispered, "I crossed that." Nell stepped closer. The timber creaked beneath her foot. Real. Cold river air rose from below, and then came another sound. Footsteps. Not theirs. Slow. Measured. Crossing wood from the far side of the bridge. Daniel froze. Someone's there. The footsteps stopped. A voice came softly from the fog ahead. You shouldn't have left it empty. Daniel turned sharply toward Nell. What was that? But Nell could not answer, because the sentence had not sounded threatening. It sounded corrective, as though somebody expected the file to have been completed long ago. Then Nell noticed something pale caught beneath the stone support bridge. An envelope. Daniel carefully reached through the rail and retrieved it. Old, yellowed, strangely dry. Across the front, in faded ink, were the words, "For Edith Prowse." By the time they returned to Edith's cottage, rain had begun falling properly. Now place the envelope carefully upon Edith's old table. The handwriting belonged to Thomas Bellamy. Inside was a letter dated November the 18th, 1968. 3 days before Thomas vanished. Nell read aloud. Edith, if anything happens, I need someone to remember this properly. They'll say I imagine things, they always do. But the bridge is wrong again. I crossed it Tuesday night and came into something I cannot sensibly explain. Not another place, not another time, the village as it remembers itself. The road did not lead to where it should. I saw lights along the bridge, though no lamps had been lit there for years. I heard music from the old hall, though the hall was demolished when I was a boy. And midway across stood a man in a dark coat. He spoke my name before I gave it. Edith. He sounded exactly like my father. And I could hear the church bell ringing through St. Jude's bell. That hasn't rung at night since the winter roof collapse in 1961. If the bridge appears again after I'm gone, do not let the file remain empty. Somebody must remember what happened there. Silence settled heavily inside the cottage. Daniel stared at the fire. So what happened to him? Nell looked toward the rain sliding down Edith's windows. That, she said quietly, is what the village decided not to answer. Inside the Bellamy folder was one small notation in Edith's pencil. Ask Ruth if she still remembers the church. Ruth Bellamy lived at the far end of Alder Vale in a narrow stone cottage overlooking the lower fields. Thomas's younger sister, 83 now, nearly blind, and according to half the village, not entirely with us anymore. Nell had learned long ago that villagers often described elderly people that way when they became inconvenient witnesses. Ruth opened the door herself when they arrived. Her pale eyes moved to Nell, then Daniel, then finally to the folder beneath Nell's arm. You found Edith's papers. Not a question. Nell nodded. You'd better come in then, she said. The cottage smelled faintly of peat smoke and old furniture polish. Photographs lined the walls. Many faded so badly the faces had become pale ghosts of themselves. Ruth sat near the fire. You crossed the bridge, she said. Daniel frowned. How do you know? Because you look exactly like people do after they have crossed it. Nell sat opposite her. Mrs. Bellamy, did Thomas drown? Ruth's face did not change. No. At last, something solid. What happened? He came home first. The room tightened around the words. He crossed the bridge and returned 3 hours later, shaking like a man pulled from deep water, but he was dry. That was the first thing I noticed. Ruth looked toward the darkened window. Thomas came home just after midnight, she said quietly. And the first thing he asked me was whether I could hear the church bell. Nell frowned slightly, but the bell wasn't ringing. No, Ruth replied. That was the trouble. St. Jude's bell hadn't rung since that night the roof collapsed in 61, but Thomas swore he heard it across the fog while he was on the bridge. She paused a moment. Edith said that was the moment she believed him. Daniel leaned forward. What else did he say? That the bridge had shown him what the village refused to remember. Ruth reached beside her chair and lifted an old biscuit tin wrapped in cloth. I told Edith never to put these in the files. Inside were photographs, original photographs, the bridge intact, lanterns hanging from the rails, villagers gathered in fog, children blurred near the riverbank. And in the centre stood Thomas Bellamy himself, young, dark-haired, pale with fear. Beside him stood a tall man in a dark overcoat. Daniel frowned. Who is that? Ruth's eyes never left the photograph. That's my father. Nell looked back down sharply. The photograph was dated November 1968. But Thomas and Ruth's father had died in 1952. Daniel whispered, That's impossible. Ruth closed her eyes briefly. Yes, that's why everyone preferred the drowning explanation. Nell spoke softly. But it wasn't really your father, was it? Ruth looked toward the fire. No, she said. The room seemed to exhale. It looked like him because Thomas trusted him. The bridge does that. It reflects memory back at people in forms that they understand. Grief, guilt, things left unresolved. Nell felt the truth settle slowly. Not ghosts, not time travel, something stranger. A place so saturated with silence that memory itself had become atmosphere. Ruth continued quietly. Thomas already suspected something before he crossed the bridge the first time. What? There was a girl, Annie Vale, 16, worked at the old hall. She vanished walking home over Bellamy Bridge one winter night. Nell felt cold move through her chest. What happened to her? The village decided she'd run away. Ruth's voice hardened slightly. They said that about girls then. Easier than asking who frightened them. Daniel sat very still. Thomas knew otherwise. He found her scarf years later caught beneath the bridge rail, hidden in stonework, and a watch chain beside it. Whose? Ruth looked away. Councillor Harrow's son. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything supernatural. The village protected him, Daniel said. No, Ruth replied quietly. The village protected its own comfort. There's a difference. What happened to Harrow's son afterwards? Daniel asked quietly. Ruth gave a tired sigh. He left the village not long after Thomas disappeared. London first, then farther north, I think. His father made certain no questions followed him. Did people suspect? Nell asked. Ruth gave the fainted smile. Villages always suspect. They just choose which truths are worth the discomfort. She stared into the fire. Councillor Harrow remained on the parish council another 11 years. Most people preferred not to remember why Thomas Bellamy stopped walking through the square. And then she removed one final folded page from the tin. Thomas Bellamy's handwriting again. Annie did not run away. Harrow's boy admitted enough after drink loosened his mouth. Not all, never all, but enough. I refused to let Annie disappear or vanish twice. Nell looked up slowly. So Thomas crossed the bridge, came home and then went back? Ruth nodded. He believed the bridge showed him what the village had buried. Not magic, not ghosts, truth. He said the place itself remembered. And the second time he went to confront Harrow's son near the bridge. He said he would force the truth into daylight. Ruth's eyes lowered. He never came home again. The room fell silent. Not mysterious, now tragic, human. And the drowning story, Daniel asked quietly. Easier for everyone, Ruth said. Nell closed her eyes briefly. There it was, the real haunting, not the bridge, the erasure. By dusk, Nell returned alone to Edith's cottage. She spread everything carefully across the table. Thomas's letter, the photographs, Ruth's statement. The clipping about Thomas Bellamy and the second clipping about Annie Vale hidden deep inside. An unrelated parish file. Local girl believed to have left village. 2 cruel lines. No search, no outrage, no memory. Nell sat for a long time beneath or beside Edith's fire. Then she took out a clean sheet of paper. At the top she wrote, Rowan File number 12, the file left empty, and beneath that, Bellamy Bridge, Annie Vale, Thomas Bellamy, and the village that forgot on purpose. Then she added Edith's word, not to prove, to preserve. For a long moment Nell stared at the blank page beneath the title. Then she began writing. Today the bridge was crossed again. Daniel Mercer saw what Aldervale had taught itself not to see. Ruth Bellamy remembered what others called confusion. Thomas Bellamy did not drown in fog. Annie Vale did not vanish by choice. The bridge does not cross time, it crosses memory. And memory, when denied long enough, finds other ways to return. The fire shifted softly in the grate. Outside, the rain had stopped. And for the first time all day, the village sounded ordinary again. A car passed in the lane. Someone laughed outside the pub. A dog barked twice. Life continuing, as it always did, once it had decided what not to notice. Nell tied the folder closed with a lavender ribbon. This time the ribbon did not look decorative, it looked ceremonial, a promise. The next morning, Clara Bennett found a small handwritten note pinned carefully beside the tea room doorway. Not dramatic, not accusing, simply Annie Vale, remembered here. And beneath it, Thomas Bellamy, remembered here. People stopped to read it throughout the morning. Some frowned, some muttered, and some pretended not to notice at all. But old Mr. Pritchard stood before the notice for nearly 5 minutes and quietly removed his cap. By lunchtime, somebody had left primroses beneath it. By evening, there were 2 bunches. Aldervale did not change overnight, villages rarely do, but something had shifted. A silence that had been interrupted. And sometimes, Nell thought, that was enough to begin with. That night, back inside her own cottage, Nell opened the cabinet she had brought from Edith's study. The folders sat neatly inside now, lavender ribbons faded with age. On the top shelf she placed the Bellamy file, no longer empty. Then she took a fresh folder from the drawer below, new paper, clean label, unwritten. For a moment she wondered what Edith would have called it, and then she smiled faintly and wrote, Rowan Files. Continued by Nell Rowan. Outside, mist gathers softly along the lane, not threatening, not inviting, simply present, as though the village itself had leaned slightly closer to see whether she intended to keep her promise. Now closed the cabinet gently, and for the first time she understood. The lavender ladies had never been trying to prove strange things. They had just been trying to stop the truth from disappearing beneath ordinary life. The Rowan Files had begun, not to prove but to preserve. The Rowan Files now will be continued by Nell, who was left to carry on the discoveries that the Lavender Ladies had started.